The beekeeping industry is in crisis over the shocking and unexplained deaths of hundreds of millions of bees over the last 8 months.
For over a century, Australia had remained completely untouched by the world's most devastating bee killer. Its strict biosecurity measures had protected millions of colonies from the terrifying Varroa mite while other nations watched their bee populations collapse. But in June 2022, that perfect protection finally cracked. We lose 80 of our bees every year. The industry cannot survive, which means we cannot pollinate at the scale that we need to produce food. The mite entered the country, and what followed was the largest agricultural emergency response in Australia's history. A desperate millions of dollars battle against an enemy barely visible to the naked eye. What happened after 1 year was absolutely shocking, and the results changed everything we thought we knew about protecting an entire continent. The last safe place on Earth. Australia used to be a special country when it came to bees. Out of all the major honey-producing countries on the planet, it was the only one that the world's deadliest bee killer had never touched. While beekeepers in America, Europe, and New Zealand fought this invisible enemy for decades, Australia remained completely safe. The massive continent was like a protected island where millions of bees could live without fear of the deadly Varroa mite. But that protection came with a price. Australia had some of the strictest border controls on the planet. Every single package, every airplane, every ship that entered the country was carefully checked. The government spent millions of dollars keeping dangerous pests out. And for the longest time, it worked perfectly. Australian beekeepers felt lucky. They watched the news from other countries where entire bee colonies were dying off. They saw beekeepers in New Zealand struggling to save their hives. They heard about the massive bee deaths in America and Europe. Yet, their own hives stayed healthy and strong. The honey industry in Australia was worth billions of dollars. Everything seemed perfect in this bee paradise. But deep down, experts knew that this protection couldn't last forever. The world was getting smaller, and travel between countries was getting easier every year. Australia is the only continent free of the Varroa mites, scientists kept saying, but they always added a scary warning. For now, it's not a matter of if, but when. They knew something this dangerous and this widespread would eventually find a way in. The question wasn't whether it would happen, but how bad it would be when it finally arrived. The nightmare begins. June 2022 changed everything. At a busy port near Newcastle in New South Wales, inspectors made a discovery that shocked the entire country. The Varroa destructor had finally arrived in Australia. This tiny parasite, barely the size of a sesame seed, had somehow made it past all the security measures that had protected Australia for over a century. The first detection was like finding the first zombie in a horror movie. You know that if there's one, there are probably many more hiding somewhere. Within days, the worst fears came true. More Varroa mites were found in hives 100 kilometers away from the first discovery. Somehow, this deadly parasite had already started spreading. The government's response was swift and brutal. A massive 31m emergency zone was created around the infected areas. Every single beehive within 6 milliseconds of a confirmed infection had to be destroyed immediately. The remaining 25 miles became a monitoring zone where every bee was watched carefully. But here's what made it truly terrifying. They destroyed healthy hives, too. If healthy bees lived in the wrong place at the wrong time, they were sentenced to death, even if they showed no signs of infection. It was like bringing down entire neighborhoods to stop a fire from spreading. The numbers were staggering. In just a few months, over 28,000 beehives were wiped out across 250 different bee farms. Each hive contained between 10,000 and 30,000 bees. That means roughly 560 million bees were killed in the battle to stop this invasion. The eradication zones covered more than 4 million acres. That's 2 of the entire state of New South Wales. The death toll was massive, and it was all due to a pest that was about to create even more mayhem. Meet the killer. What exactly was this tiny destroyer that had started killing all the bees in Australia? The Varroa destructor looks harmless enough. A small reddish-brown dot about the size of a sesame seed. But don't let its size fool you. This little creature is considered one of the most dangerous parasites in the world relative to its host. These mites don't just bite and run away. They latch onto bees like tiny vampires and stay there feeding constantly. But the really scary part is that they don't even drink blood like most parasites. Instead, they eat something much more important, the bee's fat body. This is like eating a bee's liver, brain, and energy storage system all at once. The varroa mite originally lived in Asia and fed on Asian honeybees. Those bees had learned to live with the mites over thousands of years and could survive their presence in their hives. But when the mites discovered European honeybees, it was like a disease jumping from animals to humans. European bees had no defenses against this new enemy. When varroa mites attack a hive, they don't just weaken individual bees, they spread deadly viruses from bee to bee. The worst virus is called the deformed wing virus, which does exactly what the name suggests. Infected bees are born with twisted, useless wings. They can't fly, can't work, and can't help their colony survive. One mite becomes two becomes four, and soon the entire hive is overrun. Within 2 to 3 years, most infected hives die completely. It's a slow, unstoppable death sentence that spreads from bee to bee until nothing is left. And for Australia, this downhill spiral had just begun. The science of destruction. Female mites have perfected the art of bee assassination over millions of years, and their method is both brilliant and terrifying. When a pregnant female mite is ready to reproduce, she doesn't just randomly attack any bee. She's incredibly smart about choosing her victims. She specifically targets drone cells, the larger cells where male bees develop, because they take longer to mature. This gives her more time to breed an army of offspring. The mite sneaks into the cell just before worker bees seal it with wax. Once trapped inside with the developing bee larvae, she waits patiently in the food provided by worker bees. When the cell gets sealed, something switches on in her brain. It's time to start the nightmare. She emerges from hiding and begins feeding on the helpless larvae. But she's not just eating for herself. After her first meal, she lays her first egg, which is mostly male. Then she continues laying eggs every single day, each one female, and destined to become a killer like her mother. Here's where it gets disturbing. All of her children start feeding on the same larvae while it's still alive and trying to develop. It's like being slowly eaten alive by a growing family of vampires while you're trapped in a sealed coffin. When the young adult bees finally emerge from their cells, they are already doomed. If they survive the initial feeding damage, they carry multiple adult female mites with them. These mites then spread to other bees in the colony and the cycle begins again. But the mites have one more weapon. They inject viruses directly into the bee's body while feeding. The open wounds from mite feeding become perfect entry points for deadly diseases. Even if a bee survives the physical damage from mites, the viruses they carry often finish the job. The bees don't stand a single chance against these minuscule monsters, but their sacrifice means nothing when the invasion spreads through their ravaged bodies and the mites move onto the rest of the colony for a mass massacre of bees. How the invasion spread. The timing of the varroa mite discovery couldn't have been worse. It happened right during Australia's biggest bee movement of the year, almond pollination season. Every August, farmers use 300,000 hives to pollinate almond crops. It's the largest movement of insects in the entire country, with bees travelling hundreds of miles to do their job. One of Australia's biggest beekeeping companies with 7,000 hives had just shipped 4,000 of them to northwestern Victoria for pollination work. Other companies did the same thing, moving their hives from areas around Kempe, the exact same region where mites were later discovered. By the time scientists found the mites, it was too late. Thousands of hives had already been moved from infected areas to clean areas. The mites hitchhiked on these traveling bees like tiny stowaways, spreading the infection across hundreds of miles in just a few weeks. Modern beekeeping made the problem even worse. Beekeepers place their hives very close together to make management easier. When one colony starts dying from mites, bees from nearby hives smell the honey and come over to steal it. The mites jump onto these robber bees and ride them back to their healthy hives. It's like having sick people cough in crowded elevators all day long. The disease spreads faster than anyone can stop it. That's why authorities had to destroy every hive in the infected areas, even the healthy ones. You can't explain to bees that they shouldn't visit their dying neighbors. Stealing honey from a failing hive is their nature and in this case their downfall. As authorities scrambled to identify and contain the infection, the official map of the invasion looked like something from a war zone. The battle lines were clear and the enemy was winning. The millions of dollars war. When the Australian government realized that the Varroa mite had started killing all the bees in areas across multiple states, they declared war. This wasn't just about saving some insects. This was about protecting the entire food supply of the continent. The response became the largest agricultural emergency in Australia's history. Over $100 million was spent trying to stop the Varroa mite invasion. Special teams of experts were hired and trained to become professional mite assassins. These weren't ordinary pest control workers. They were highly trained specialists who understood exactly how these tiny killers operated. Their job was to inspect hives, destroy infected colonies, and try to create barriers to stop the spread. A bee lockdown was declared across entire states. Beekeepers couldn't move their hives anywhere without special permission. It was like having travel restrictions, but for insects. Every bee farm became a potential crime scene that needed to be investigated. The inspection process was incredibly detailed. Teams would arrive at bee farms wearing protective suits, carrying special equipment to detect mites. Hives within 10 kilometers of any infection were automatically destroyed. Hives within 25 kilometers were inspected and monitored constantly. But despite all the money, all the experts, and all the emergency measures, the war was being lost. By 2023, there had been more confirmed outbreaks. The mites had spread from Newcastle to the northern coast of New South Wales, then to areas near the Victorian border. Every battle won was followed by more defeats. Every hive saved meant 10 more were discovered to be infected. The enemy was too small to see, too fast to catch, and too smart to defeat with traditional methods when fighting became impossible. September 2023 marked a turning point in the war against Varroa mites. After spending millions of dollars and destroying hundreds of thousands of hives, government officials made a heartbreaking announcement. They were giving up the fight to eliminate the mites completely. It wasn't that they didn't want to keep fighting. The problem was that the enemy had already won. Scientific data showed that no matter how many hives they destroyed, new infections kept appearing. Some beekeepers weren't following the rules perfectly. The territories were too large to monitor completely, and the mites were spreading faster than anyone could keep up with. The government switched from eradication to management. Instead of trying to kill every single mite in Australia, they would now focus on teaching beekeepers how to live with them. It was like accepting that a dangerous disease would always be around, but learning how to treat it instead of cure it. A new 24-month plan called the Transition to Management Program was created. The focus changed completely. Instead of destroying hives, they would train beekeepers. Instead of creating quarantine zones, they would teach people how to spot infections early. This decision meant that all those millions of bees that had been killed might have died for nothing. If the mites were going to spread across Australia anyway, then destroying healthy hives didn't actually save the continent. It just delayed the inevitable while killing countless innocent bees. The thought alone was devastating for the countless beekeepers who had been forced to send their beloved colonies to slaughter for nothing. The establishment of Varroa mites in Australia will radically change the way European honeybees are managed, experts stated. Translation: the old ways of beekeeping in Australia were over forever. The once untouchable continent had been invaded, and the enemy had established roots on the territory that were simply too deep to cut. The nightmare that started killing all the bees in Australia was now permanently part of life on the continent. There would be no returning to the safe, protected paradise Australian bees had enjoyed for over a century. According to the experts, the only thing beekeepers could do now was adapt. But they might have underestimated the people they were working with. Learning to fight back, Australian beekeepers weren't ready to give up completely. As the government shifted from eradication to management, something remarkable began happening across the continent. Beekeepers started becoming bee doctors, learning skills that their counterparts in other countries had been forced to master decades earlier. The transition plan introduced specialist roles that sounded like characters from a medical drama. Varroa development officers became the equivalent of traveling doctors moving from farm to farm and teaching beekeepers how to spot early infections. These videos weren't just giving basic advice, but teaching advanced techniques that required precision timing and careful observation. Beekeepers learned to count fallen mites using sticky boards placed under their hives. It sounds simple, but there's actually a complex mathematical formula involved. After 72 hours, they would count the mites on the board and use the equation to estimate the total mite in their colony. If more than 3 of their bees were infected, emergency treatment was needed immediately. The most dramatic technique was called the alcohol wash method. Beekeepers would capture exactly 300 bees from their hive and shake them in a jar of alcohol to dislodge and count mites. It was brutal but effective. The alcohol killed the sample of bees, but gave precise data about mite levels. Some beekeepers used powdered sugar instead to keep the bees alive. But the alcohol method was more accurate for making life or death decisions about their colonies. Chemical warfare became part of everyday beekeeping. Products with names like amitraz, coumaphos, and flumethrin entered the vocabulary of Australian beekeepers. These weren't simple sprays. They were sophisticated weapons that had to be applied at exactly the right time to kill mites without contaminating honey or harming the bees themselves. The timing was everything. Applying treatments too early might kill developing bee larvae along with the mites. If they are applied too late, the mite population will explode beyond control. Some treatments came as plastic strips that slowly released chemicals over weeks. Others were acids that had to be vaporized and carefully distributed through the hive. Australian beekeepers also discovered the drone sacrifice technique. Since mites prefer to breed in drone cells, beekeepers started deliberately creating more drone comb as traps. When the cells were filled with developing drones and mites, the entire section would be frozen or destroyed, taking thousands of mites with it. It was a strategic sacrifice, losing some bees to save the entire colony. And it's in this tense climate that nature found its way to shine. Nature's surprising solution. While European honeybees were dying from Varroa mites, something interesting was happening with Australia's native bees. These local insects, which had been pushed aside by imported honeybees for decades, suddenly had a chance to make a comeback. Australia has over 2,000 species of native bees, and they're completely immune to Varroa mites. The mites simply can't survive on these local insects because they evolved together with different types of bees in Asia. It's like a disease that affects only one specific animal. It can't jump to a completely different species. For the past 2 centuries, European honeybees had been taking over Australia's ecosystem. They were incredibly good at finding flowers and collecting nectar, which meant they outco-competed many native pollinators. Some areas had lost most of their native bee populations because the imported bees were so successful. But now, as Varroa mites start killing European honeybees across Australia, native bees have an opportunity. Every hive that dies from mites creates space for native bees to return. Every area that loses its European bees becomes available for local insects to reclaim. This could actually be good news for Australia's natural environment. Native bees are perfectly adapted to local plants and conditions. They've been pollinating Australian flowers for millions of years. Long before humans brought European bees to the continent, scientists are starting to wonder if the Varroa mite invasion might accidentally help restore Australia's natural balance. It's like removing an invasive species by introducing another invasive species. Sometimes nature finds its own way to fix problems that humans created. Of course, this doesn't help farmers who depend on European honeybees for crop pollination. But it does show that even in disasters, nature sometimes finds unexpected ways to heal itself. The massive results after 1 year, 12 months after the Varroa mite was first discovered, the results were absolutely massive, just not in the way anyone expected. Instead of defeating the tiny killer, Australia had completely changed how it thought about bees, farming, and protecting the environment. The bee industry had been transformed overnight. Beekeepers who used to move their hives freely now needed special permits and constant inspections. The cost of keeping bees increased dramatically. But here's where it gets really interesting. Some beekeepers started experimenting with a radical approach. Instead of fighting the mites with chemicals and treatments, they decided to let nature take its course. They allowed their weakest colonies to die and bred new bees from the survivors. One beekeeper had tried this approach in the 1990s. He let mites attack 1,000 of his colonies and didn't treat them at all. Only 9 colonies survived the first year, but those survivors were naturally resistant to mites. He bred new bees from these tough survivors, and his problems with mites disappeared. This natural selection approach is brutal but effective. It means accepting massive losses in the short term to create stronger bees in the long term. It's like training an army by putting soldiers through the hardest possible conditions and keeping only the ones who survive. Meanwhile, technology started offering new solutions. Smart beehives with cameras were being tested. These high-tech hives could automatically detect mites and send text message alerts to beekeepers. Stricter measures were also implemented at ports and airports to catch new invasions before they spread in the first place. But the most massive result was psychological. Australians realized that their continent wasn't as protected or isolated as they thought. Not with international traveling being so frequent and widespread, especially after the coronavirus pandemic. If something as tiny as a sesame seed could defeat millions of dollars worth of biosecurity measures, what else might be coming? This was a question the authorities weren't ready to face yet. But Australians already knew the answer. When the time came, not if, when they would be ready and they would adapt, just like their bees. The new reality. Today, the mite that started killing all the bees in Australia has become a permanent part of life on the continent. After 1 year, the results weren't victory or defeat. They were adaptation. Australia learned to live with an enemy that couldn't be eliminated. The varroa is now spreading slowly but steadily across the country. Scientists predict it will take about 5 years to reach every corner of Australia. Wild European honeybee colonies are expected to die off almost completely, while managed hives will survive only with constant treatment and monitoring. But something unexpected happened during this crisis. Australians started paying attention to their native bees for the first time in generations. Scientists began studying flower flies as backup pollinators. Farmers started planting flowers that attract local insects instead of just European honeybees. The massive results include a complete transformation of Australian agriculture. Beekeepers now check their hives 3 times more often. Chemical treatments have become routine. Cross-state bee movements require paperwork and inspections. The free and easy beekeeping of the past is gone forever. Yet, Australian bees are still alive, still making honey, and still pollinating crops. The industry adapted instead of disappearing. The continent learned to manage a threat instead of eliminating it. Sometimes survival isn't about winning wars. It's about learning to live with permanent challenges.